And now on Esoteric Cliffnotes, we have The Immortality Key by Brian Muraresku. Before diving in, I just want to share a little disclaimer for any staunch Catholics or Christians listening who have not had any experiences with psychedelics. There may be some hypotheses or some suggestions that are raised in this book that might be a bit unsettling, but I found this very interesting because this was the first book I read that really combined kind of both perspectives in one, you could say, thesis. So, all right, let's get into it. Forward. Primitive, quote-unquote, Christianity started out around 2,000 years ago as merely the latest form or incarnation of this archaic religion, and, at least in some cases, seems to have made use of bread and wine infused with psychedelic plants and fungi as its sacrament. And more often than not, these secret ceremonies of direct experiential communion with the divine were led by women, with men playing a secondary role. Introduction. Birth and death actually don't have any meaning. There's no beginning or end. Every moment is an eternity of its own. If you die before you die, you won't die when you die. Not only is there evidence of psychedelic beer and wine at the heart of the Greek and Christian mysteries, but also evidence of their suppression by the religious authorities. Part 1. Brewing the Psychedelic Beer. Chapter 1. Identity Crisis. When one ill-fated classicist by the name of Carl Ruck at Boston University took charge of the pagan continuity hypothesis with a psychedelic twist in the late 1970s, he started by claiming that the sacramental potion known as commune was a type of visionary brew, and that the inviolable secrecy surrounding the mysteries of Ulysses had everything to do with protecting the psychedelic recipe that guaranteed immortality to the Greek-speaking world. When we look at the Last Supper, and that's the painting, maybe we're not looking at Christianity's founding event. Maybe we're getting a glimpse of the mysterious religion that was practiced by Plato, Pindar, Sophocles, and the rest of the Athenian gang. Chapter 2. Fall from Grace. Where there is barley, there is ergot, that fungal parasite mentioned above, also known as, this is the Latin word, claviceps purpurea. Oh gosh, I probably butchered that. My old Latin teacher would cringe. It regularly infects cereal grains like barley as well as wheat and rye. Ergot is notoriously poisonous. Across Europe and in the Middle Ages, as a matter of fact, contaminated bread would lead to routine bouts of ergot poisoning or ergotism. It became known as St. Anthony's fire, in reference to the monks of the order of St. Anthony who proved adept at treating the afflicted. Hoffman had accidentally synthesized LSD while trying to create new relief for circulation and respiratory disorders. Its psychoactive profile wasn't discovered until years later in 1943 when Hoffman decided to self-experiment. Hoffman tracked down and analyzed the ergot of wheat and barley. He found they indeed contained two psychoactive alkaloids. Both are soluble in water, meaning with the techniques and equipment available in antiquity, it was therefore easy to prepare a hallucinogenic extract. In Ruck's analysis of the Gospels, Paul's letters, and other Greek language documents of the era, the earliest generations of Christians inherited a mind-altering sacrament from the Greeks, replacing Demeter's beer with Dionysus wine as a vehicle for the psychedelic kick. Chapter 3. Barley meal and laurel leaves. In Alexandria, as elsewhere, This kind of wanton mayhem was part of a wider campaign of spiritual, what today we might call psychological warfare. Theophilus would replace the ancient temple of Serapis with a church to house some relics of John the Baptist that had been procured from Palestine. It was a, quote, consciously planned propagation, unquote. The goal, in unmistakable fashion, was to claim exclusive possession of the physical and symbolic fabric of the city and capital of Egypt, which now belonged to Christ and the God of the Christians. And to explore this, the author travels really all over Europe just to look for traces of this psychedelic beer, psychedelic wine, and these ceremonies. And somebody giving him a tour, personal tour, says, in fact, I think they used drugs because they wanted to have illusions. Visions, yes. In antiquity, this was not so strange. For example, what is the name of this plant, the one with the morphine? Yes, the poppy. You see the poppy everywhere. And then there's Delphi. They say the Pythia had eaten leaves from what? From the laurel. This too provoked visions, because it has oily leaves, and the oil is in a way a drug. When it comes to drugs, classists are simply out of their depth. Aside from the ethylene, there's no ruling out the barley meal or laurel leaves as additional tools for causing or enhancing the Pythia's altered state of consciousness. The plants were long associated with Delphi by Plutarch and Achilles. In a total blind spot, however, a scholar as formidable as Burkitt fails to comment on the potentiality psychoactive properties of ancient Greek laurel. So, Homer tells us the Grand High Witch mixed the, quote, evil drugs into the men's food after having stirred up or mixed up a special potion for the occasion. And this is the Homer. The earliest written example of which is the Rig Veda, a collection of sacred hymns composed as early as 1700 BC, and this is in Sanskrit. If the Iliad and the Odyssey are the mother texts of Western civilization, then the Rig Veda is our grandmother, and there we find the original, quote, mixed potion, a sacramental drink called soma. Just like the kukion of Circe and Demeter, the preparation of soma is often tied to the female presence. It is referred to as the elixir of life and is explicitly characterized as Madeira, the Sanskrit term that Watkins translates as intoxicant or hallucinogenic. Chapter 4. Secret of Secrets. When the crops are not tended with proper care, a dangerous weed begins to grow. It is barley's evil stepsister, darnel. The job of the priestess recompense would have been to monitor closely the growth of the darnel and ergot so that neither got out of control. Too much, and the deadly weed and fungus can ruin the entire crop, threatening life itself. Too little, and there's no active ingredient for the kukion. Only when chaos and cosmos work together do the raw psychedelic ingredients of the sacrament result. There's so much great stuff in this book. I don't think I'm going to get to all of it, just for time's sake. Chapter 5. The Beatific Vision. Oh, here's an interesting bit. So this is interesting, the archaeologist lit up. A little Christian church, post-Byzantine, dedicated to our Virgin Mother, or Mater Dolorosa, also. But there was more. Her festival is also in the autumn, and the women of Ulysses come here bringing loaves of bread for the priest to bless. Just like the meter, the grain mother. It's the same story, just a different name for 2,000 years. And then, of course, this reminds me of Dolores in Westworld, but we won't fall down that idea right now. Chapter 6, Graveyard Beer. This is one of the major mistakes people are making if they think about former beer making. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with heat. Just take the cereal and put it in water. That's it. And that will ferment? Yes, the yeast will come from your hand, replies the brewer. And there's really enough to kickstart the fermentation process? Yes, you have enough. If the yeast is active and vital enough, then fermentation will start because our body has an entire microbiome on the skin. Religion wasn't a byproduct of civilization. the Anatolian graveyard beer just might be the secret inspiration behind European civilization. If brewing was the cause of the agricultural revolution itself, then it also could have spawned the movement that forever replaced the hunters and gatherers of Europe with the city folk of today. Chapter 7. Kukion of Catalonia. In ancient Greece, dogs were also associated with the afterlife, where they marked the three distinct phases of the immortal journey: the passage from life to death, the time spent in the underworld, and the return to life as a spirit. The most famous hellhound was Cerberus, the three-headed dog who belonged to Hecate. Canine sacrifices in her honor were common in ancient Greece, and they found these mass graves with a bunch of, dog skeletons in the same places that this psychedelic beer was found. What Rook calls the secret of secrets, and what Martin Zarnkow refers to as the controlled contamination of a volatile fungal parasite that turns healthy grain into mad grain to produce LSD beer, a welcome addition to all the nightshade beers in the region. In the process, the reunited relatives appear to have constructed the Ulysses of the West for any locals who couldn't afford the trip to Athens. Whenever a skull shows up, some very ancient religion is at play. Over a couple of dense pages in the Catalan monograph, Juan charts the various death cults that have been archaeologically catalogued across the Celtic strongholds of the British Isles, Belgium, France, and Spain, where defleshing of corpses, ritual decapitation, and a court of skulls are all attested. Now, this isn't the first time that the author makes a connection between these rituals and death cults. Just a note from the reader here. I think this is where maybe some folks may disagree, that death cults and psychedelics and this ancient religion aren't exactly one and the same. A knife can be used to cut a mango. A knife can be used to really hurt somebody or hurt yourself. The same goes with psychedelics. And this was written by somebody that has never done psychedelics before. And so, I think you can kind of go either path. And so I think that association is a bit naive. All right, moving on. Considering the fact that residue of ergot was found, it would seem to substantiate the idea that some kind of visionary ceremony for the grain goddess or Persephone was being celebrated in a household shrine. All right, epilogue to part 1. The presence of ergot is clearly documented, not only in the vessel itself, like Shakespeare's pipe, but in the human skull. It all points to some kind of hallucinogenic beer being not only prepared but consumed. And the reference to Shakespeare's pipe is, I think they found weed in his pipe. Or traces of weed. Alright, part 2. Mixing the psychedelic wine. Chapter 8. The Drug of Immortality. The world's most controversial priest was a safe bet. It's a nickname Father Francis earned for suggesting Jesus' death and resurrection were not in fact a unique event, contradicting 2,000 years of church dogma. In Rainbow Body and Resurrection from 2016, the intrepid priest published the results of his decades-long inquiry into the so-called rainbow body phenomenon of Tibetan Buddhism. He schlepped all over the Indian continent and the Himalayas, tracking down eyewitness accounts of spiritual gurus whose physical bodies were said to shrink or disappear after death, often transforming into radiant displays of multicolored light. We call the Eucharist pharmakon athanasius, he beams, using the ancient Greek phrase for the drug of immortality. And so the author and this Father Francis go to the Louvre to look at ancient Greek artifacts, that some of them are not on display, just to look for any hints of psychedelics. In the left hand, a blob of crimson that could very well be a mushroom. On the right, who knows? Either way, the priest agrees that the Maynard's ingredients were definitely destined for the wine, and the way the botanicals were painted accentuates their unique role in the mixing ritual. Alright, Chapter 9, Vineyards of Heaven. In order to portray Jesus as the consummate Son of God, John knew all the loaded terms that would appeal to any Greek speaker of the time, and he used them throughout his gospel to depict Jesus as the second coming of Dionysus. Gosh, why is this? Dionysus. Without the wine, there is no Dionysus, and without the Eucharist, there is no Christianity. The potion that would become the calling card of the new church begins right here on Veronese's 16th century version of the water-to-wine miracle at Cana. This is how Dionysus enters Christianity, and this is how the ancient Greek pharmakon is transformed into the pharmakon Athanasius, the drug of immortality. John wanted his Greek-speaking audience to immediately associate Jesus with the god of ecstasy. And the painting that the author references here is the wedding at Cana, which is also displayed at the Louvre. And it's actually just opposite from the Mona Lisa. And if you ask me, it's actually prettier. Okay. Before, during, and after the life of Jesus in Nazareth, the god of ecstasy enjoyed a loyal following in the neighborhood. The archaeological finds from Scythopolis to Sepphoris to Petra are clear about that, as in they found frescoes and all that stuff, hailing Dionysus. Okay, Chapter 10, Holy Elixirs in the Holy Land. Another incarnation of Osiris, the blue water lily, is now extremely rare in the wild, but once grew abundantly on the shallow banks of the Nile. It was considered ancient Egypt's most sacred plant, and with the active compounds aporphormine and nuciferin, it was full of psychoactive possibility. Historically, shamans in Central Asia have resorted to juniper for ritual, magical, and medicinal purposes, making it likely one of the oldest fumigants of humankind. The Hansa people of the Hindu Kush in northern Pakistan, for example, say juniper is directly responsible for the, quote, supernatural powers of their bitayos, the magicians, healers, and prophets. The most powerful empire in the world, an all-male enterprise, was clamping down on female-led religion that promised immortality to its initiates, and that's referring to the Roman Empire. Dionysus' churches were kept off the grid in the open air of the Greek countryside. And the author continues making kind of parallels or comparisons between Dionysus and Jesus, paintings and depictions. We won't get into that. Chapter 11, Drunk with the Nectar of Eternity. Using the verb ayamai to describe Jesus' healing miracles, a literal translation would be to cure by means of drugs. In Matthew 19:12, Mark 2:17, and Luke 4:23, after all, Jesus does specifically refer to himself as iatros, which instead of drug man is generically rendered as physician. So, drug dealer? Alright. The influence of the mystery religions of Christianity. This was written by Dr. King, that's Dr. Martin Luther King. For him, it was pointless to deny that Christianity was greatly influenced by the mystery religions, both from a ritual and doctrinal angle. Yeah, there's some mention of animal sacrifice, and really the thing was that the animal, whether it was a lamb or a goat, could eat the psychedelic plant without dying. And then folks would drink the blood because it still had the psychoactive properties, but none of the poisons that came with it. There's some parallels to death cults, and I'm just going to skip over that because that's not a part that we're interested in. Like something out of the Egyptian or Tibetan books of the dead, Mary goes on to reveal privileged information about the death and dying process. So there's this... there's some books that show that Mary Magdalene was shared some privileged information by Jesus. Chapter 12. All this was not just picnicking. St. Cosmas and Damian, with the original bronze doors. The priest points out the basilica originally dedicated to Valerius Romulus, the son of the emperor Maxentius, who underwent apotheosis and became god upon his death in AD 309, received the title Divus Romulus, the god Romulus. The site was later Christianized on behalf of the twin Syrian brothers and patron saints of pharmacists. Paul reprimands the female stacked church for letting their solemn Christian ceremony delve into a mind-altering Dionysian party. Having already condemned their version of the Eucharist as a cup of demons, Paul complains in 1 Corinthians 11:21 that the communal meal in the Greek house church looks more like an agape, a free-for-all where some overindulge. Which makes Paul's I told you so moment in 1 Corinthians 11:30 all the more understandable. In English, the line is usually translated, "That's why so many of you are weak and sick, and a number of you have fallen asleep." Ruck translates the Greek word koimontai, precisely the way it's translated elsewhere in the New Testament. That's why a considerable number of you are dying. And this is, I guess, some of those psychedelics, if you took too much, you'd slip to the next. The Eucharist is celebrated in communion with the whole church of both heaven and of earth, and that the oblation is made for her and for all her members, living and dead, who are called to participate in the redemption and salvation purchased by the body and blood of Christ. Chapter 13, the Holy Grail. According to Ramsay MacMullen, the pagan and Christian rituals could coexist and overlap. Christians did perform the refrigerum, and the wine was essential for the magic. And what he's referring to is a night ceremony where they drink and they commune with their past loved ones. And he mentions some references to some ancient Greek and Roman texts and mythology that mentions this psychedelic wine. And him and Father Francis tour some old sites that have kind of frescoes that show this ceremony. As Christians, they would have tried to depict their beliefs under the veil of other, more acceptable symbols, because they couldn't just explicitly say they were Christian. For those who knew, the images could be interpreted as Christian, the Good Shepherd and the St. Paul and so forth. The banquet of the refrigerum, of course, resonates with the New Testament narratives of the Last Supper, but for those who weren't Christians, it would just look like a refrigerum. The whole scheme is deliberately designed external presentation that would be acceptable in society where Christianity was not a lawful religion. Chapter 14, Agnostic Eucharist. The Acts of Peter, an apocryphal Greek text from the 2nd century AD, dramatizes the death of their spell-binding leader. When Simon Magus was levitating in the Roman Forum one day, St. Peter prayed for God Almighty himself to stop the arch-heretic in midair. Without delay, Simon Magus fell to the ground, breaking his leg at the site of the current-day church of Santa Francesca Romana. The equation of woman with sexuality, says Karen Jo Torstenson, and when women were priests, meant she was both subordinated to man and alienated from God. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene and other Gnostic writings, strategically banned from the final version of the New Testament that was adopted by church councils in both the Catholic West and the Orthodox East during the 4th and 5th centuries AD, all memory of the Gnostics was excised from the history of the Church of Rome. Okay, there's a passage that's very interesting. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. So that's another parallel with Dionysius. The Latin here makes perfectly clear that the Greek speakers from the cemetery church in the catacombs of Priscilla Priscilla, tried to communicate visually. The woman is in charge of not just elevating, designating, or presenting the wine, but also of mixing the wine. Chapter 15, Mystery Coast Highway. Before Jesus, generations of women brewed the graveyard beers and mixed the graveyard wines in the Indo-European ritual that spread east and west of Stone Age Anatolia, the ritual act of communion. That was by women for women. After Jesus, there were the many women who dominated the house churches and catacombs that defined the faith, offering a safe haven for the old Greek sacrament that needed shelter from the wilderness. The witches of Persephone, who were the primary missionaries of the Phocaeans' secret cult, had every incentive to both influence and in some cases even become the witches of Christianity. Their sister witches of Dionysus, all across Magna Graecia, were in the same boat. Chapter 16, the Gospel of Infinity and the Toad Eucharist. Hatsis notes the secretions of certain poisonous toads can contain such psychoactive compounds as bufotenine, 5-HO-DMT or 5-MeO-DMT, which is structurally similar to LSD, but way stronger, or more concentrated, you could say. Chapter 17, our eyes have been opened. Oh, and in terms of that comment on Toad, there were these stories, I guess in the Middle Ages that he mentioned, where people seemed like they were dead for about 10-15 minutes and then they spring back up. That's DMT. So apparently they'd accessed DMT back then, even outside of America. Okay. Chapter 17, our eyes have been opened. According to the classists from Massachusetts, the secrets were passed on by word of mouth from a herbalist to apprentice, but more precisely, they were often entrusted from older women to younger women. And the only way to eliminate that multi-generational scourge was to round up mothers and daughters. The Vatican waged a profound psychological war on women. Another thing that's come up a few times is adding lizards to recipes, which I have strong reservations about, but apparently was a theme over the centuries. Afterward. It wasn't whether drugs were involved in the religious exercises that preceded the Greek and Christian mysteries, but when, if at all, they vanished, only to be forgotten and replaced, as Burkitt proposed, by harmless substances. And so the author and Father Francis made a pact. When the smoking gun emerges, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that the original Eucharist was in fact psychedelic, we're going to book the first flight to Rome, we're going to bust Father Francis out of his library to the south, and we're all going to drink a chalice of psychedelic wine in the city of the dead underneath St. Peter's Basilica, as it was in the beginning, with a few nuns handling the blood of Christ. I thought that was cute. Yeah, good book. If you grew up in a Christian household and you've done psychedelics, I don't think there's any surprises, or too many surprises. But the fact that I think the connection between the witch hunts and psychedelics, I think, is huge. And the fact that women had a very strong role in religion or spirituality because of their role in brewing or making the psychedelic substances, I think is also huge. And after reading this, just keeping in mind just the overall relationship that women have with religion, and that women, the evolution of male and female just relationship dynamics over the years, and its parallel with religion and the prominence of religion. I think that's an interesting kind of undertone that can be missed if we don't really think about it. Overall, great book. Lots of evidence. Seems pretty clear to me.